Aloha, I'm Mrs. Fisher, and today we're going to be looking at grammar concept number 13, semicolons, colons, and quotes. Okay, let's get started. When do you use a semicolon? You use a semicolon to join two sentences that are closely related. For example, the rising costs of electricity is a large factor for people who convert to solar panels. People cannot afford sinking money into ever-rising electric bills. So those are closely related, so we put a semicolon between them. Or two sentences of equal length. For example, some people boogie board, others surfboard. Please punctuate this sentence correctly. Some students studied for their social studies summative. Some students studied for their science summative. How would you properly punctuate that? All right, use a semicolon, rule number 3, before a conjunction when one of the sentences contains multiple commas in its clause. When I went camping, semicolon, I packed the following, colon, a tent, a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and matches. Because there are these multiple commas in the sentence after it, we put a semicolon between the two instead of a comma. Another example, when I bought a car, now this one's in the beginning of it. When I bought a car, a house, and a swing set, semicolon, my credit score plummeted. It means to go down. Number 3, the third rule. Use a semicolon before a conjunction when one of the sentences contains multiple commas in its clause. Please punctuate this sentence correctly. When I went to baseball practice, I packed the following: a water bottle, my baseball glove, and my bat. How do you punctuate that one? You use a semicolon to separate clauses if the other clauses contain commas. In this case, we have two complex sentences. When we went camping, comma, Rob made the fire. And we have the second complex sentence. I roasted marshmallows and he set up the tent. We combine those with a coordinating conjunction, voice, fan, but, or, yet, so, for, and, nor, and this time with a semicolon instead of a comma because they already had commas in them. Rule number 4, so you try punctuating this one. Where does the semicolon go in this sentence? When we went to church, Mom and I sat in the front row and I played my violin and Mom sang in the choir. All right, use a semicolon in a complex list containing its own commas. So you use a semicolon if you have a list that already has commas in the list. For example, a successful student will demonstrate the ability to write argumentative essays, narratives, and explanatory essays. Semicolon, to read literature and informational text. Semicolon, to present and speak analytically, formally, and clearly. So because you still would have used semicolons between them even if just this first one had these commas. So because these commas were separating the types of writing, we put a semicolon between the 3 categories of writing, reading, and speaking and presenting. Use a semicolon before and a comma after the following independent markers. And this is a fun one to know because if you know this, you kind of feel like, oh, I'm smarter than your average person. I know something they don't know. You always put, if this is in the middle of a sentence, you put a semicolon before it and a comma after it. For the words, these independent markers, therefore, consequently, however, moreover, for instance, nevertheless, and for example. So, here's an example of how that would look in a sentence. A successful student will demonstrate the ability to craft a convincing argument, semicolon, therefore, comma, they will have the tools to debate well. All right, so that's when you use semicolons. When do you use colons? You always use a colon to announce, introduce, or direct attention to a list, a noun phrase, a quotation, or an example or explanation. The colon replaces expressions like it is or they are. So, please pack the following items: a sleeping bag, tent, and flashlight. You use a colon to connect two sentences when the sentence summarizes, sharpens, or explains the first. So life is like a box of chocolates, colon. It can be sweet, unpredictable, exciting, and wonderful. So you just think to yourself as follows: it is, they are. So please pack the following items. They are a sleeping bag, tent, and flashlight. Life is like a box of chocolate. It is, it can be sweet, unpredictable, exciting, and wonderful. So that's where you put that colon. That's the two dots, the colon. You also use a colon to express or separate units of time, to separate a title from a subtitle, and after a salutation in a business letter. So we left at 4:30, right? So you know to put a colon between those numbers for time. I read The Chronicles of Education, colon, and now this is the title separated by a subtitle, Education in the 19th Century. Now here would be for a business letter, right? Formal, Dear Dr. Fisher, colon. If it was an informal letter, Dear Donna, comma. And now, how do you introduce a quote? So we've done semicolons, we did colons, and now we're looking at how do you introduce a quote? When introducing a quote, you do the following 4 things. You use a comma after the introductory phrase. You use quotation marks to enclose the exact words of a speaker and start the quote with a capital letter. After the end quotation mark, you put the page number, or NP for no page, in parentheses and put the period after the page number. For example, Ben Franklin said, comma, space, quote, capital, little strokes fell great oaks. I didn't put a period in here. End quote, page number in parentheses, then the period. So we used the comma after the introductory phrase, Ben Franklin said, comma. We used quotation marks to enclose the exact words of the speaker, in quotes, little strokes fell great oaks. After the end quotation mark, we put the page number, or NP if we didn't know it, in parentheses, and we put a period after the page number. Now it's your turn. Try this one. St. Jerome said, good, better, best, never let it rest till your good is better and your better is best. And then we have the page number. Unknown. How would you put that? If you chose St. Jerome said, comma, quote, capital, good, better, best, period, never let it rest, period, till your good is better and your better is best, end quote, in parentheses, NP for no page number, and a period outside, then you did it correctly. Try this one. According to Nikos Kazantzakis, in order to succeed, we must first believe that we can. Make sure you use a comma after the introductory phrase. Use quotation marks to enclose the exact words of the speaker and start the quote with a capital letter. After the end quotation mark, put the page number, or NP, in parentheses and put the period after the page number. All right, another rule on quotations is titles of little things go in quotation marks. So you enclose titles of short stories, short poems, songs, chapters, articles, other parts of a book, and parts of a magazine in quotes. I read the short story Rip Van Winkle last week. How would we punctuate that? I read the short story in quotes because it's a little thing, Rip Van Winkle, last week. Your turn. Commas and periods go inside the quotation marks. Colons and semicolons go outside the quotation marks. I read the poem, The Road Not Taken. Consequently, it helped me decide which path to take in my life. I read the poem, and then in quotes, because it's a little thing, The Road Not Taken. Semicolon, outside, consequently, comma. We learned to put consequently, semicolon before. It helped me decide which path to take in my life, period. Here's another one. Commas and periods go inside the quotation marks. Remember that semicolons and colons go outside the quotation marks. Punctuate the following. I recited the poem If. He recited Silver. They're both poems. If you wrote I recited the poem If, semicolon, he recited Silver, you were correct. And remember, the period went inside. All right, so at this time we are done with today's lesson. So we are going to now recap what we have learned up to this point. So, time to show what you know from all the other lessons. In grammar number 1, we learned to capitalize proper nouns but not common nouns, capitalize brand names but not common names, capitalize titles when they come before a person's name, but not alone in place of the name unless you're talking about a relative, and a direct address is always capitalized. The first word in every sentence is capitalized, and the first word in every poem line is capitalized. We learned to capitalize races, nationalities, states, countries, regions, religions, streets, cities, highways, bodies of water, mountains, proper noun, abbreviations, specific courses, languages. We capitalize the days of the week, the months of the year, and special calendar events, but not seasons like fall, spring, winter, or summer. We also learned when we are writing and we're writing a informational text and we're asked to use evidence, that we're always going to use quoted evidence. Quoted evidence, unless we're asked to paraphrase or summarize. And that's the only time we're going to put it in our own words, is if we paraphrase or summarize. We'll always use these signal phrases like in accordance with or according to. One way to do quoted evidence, in accordance with Herbert Hoover, comma, and we learned this today, space, quote, and you put it in quotes, and then you have, this would be the page number. If you paraphrased, it would be the same thing but without the quotes, because it's in your own words. If you summarized, you would still introduce it the same way, but it would again not be in quotes because it would be in your own words. And whenever you're asked to use evidence, you always use quoted evidence unless you're specifically asked to paraphrase or summarize. They're testing you to see if you know when you paraphrase or summarize not to use your quotes and to use your own words. All right, when you proofread and edit, you need to make sure that you double check your spelling, your capitalization, your punctuation, and your sentence structure. You do that by looking at the last sentence and reading your paper backwards, so that sometimes when you flow from beginning to end, you get confused, but if you read it backwards, then you won't get confused. It's also important to know how to use adjectives and adverbs, and we talked about how to compare those in a minute. Remember, when you're writing a narrative. Writing a narrative means that you're writing a story. It needs to be shown, not told. It needs to be experienced by your reader. We do this by creating a problem for our character, by using dialogue, which means conversation between two or more characters. And every time the character changes, you change a line and indent. You put what the character says in quotes, and you put the tagline either before it or after it, and you separate the tagline with a comma. Make sure that you do that well on your narratives, because that's the only way to get any credit, right? Remember, when you're choosing which grammar sentence is correct, to look at those pronouns. And if you ever see almost, any, none, and some, you know that you have to look at the prepositional phrase to choose your verb. So almost, any, none, and some, those are down here. So I'd have to look at my prepositional phrase. Workers, they, is or are. They are. None of the wind, is or are. They are. Our wind is an it. It is, sorry. Some of the project, it's an it, was. Some of the projects, was or were, they were. But if I see everyone, everybody, no one, nobody, anybody, someone, all of those are singular, I no longer look at this object of the preposition. So anyone, anybody, I just call it an it to choose my verb. It is, it was, it is, it was. When it comes to the direct address, remember the direct address is who you're directly addressing in the sentence. And it is set apart with a comma and is always capitalized. The appositive renames the person without a verb. So it's a noun that follows another noun, renames or identifies that person. That's an appositive. So are you positive that's Mrs. Fisher? I'm a positive. Mrs. Fisher, my teacher. So you have the noun that follows a noun. You put it in commas if you can take it out and still know who you're talking about. Otherwise, you don't put commas. All right. We also learned about how to pick the right pronoun. I love Cookie Monster. How to pick the right pronoun. And we thought carefully about the fact that the pronouns that have an M sound are objects, like the object cookie. And we said, I ate a cookie. You know, that's the direct object. I gave him a cookie. So now when we're looking at the object, I ate, or I gave him, not I gave he, right? So him is that indirect object. If it's a prepositional phrase, with whom are you speaking? Not with who. With whom. With goes with whom. All right. So that's how you pick those. The predicate nominative follows a linking verb and renames the subject. So you have Mrs. Fisher is the teacher. The teacher is Mrs. Fisher. If you were trying to find the pronoun reference that went with that, then you would say Mrs. Fisher is she, because it's in the subjective case. You wouldn't say Mrs. Fisher is her. Because you wouldn't say her is Mrs. Fisher. You would say she is Mrs. Fisher. All right. We also learned that our mood and voice are very important. We know that we have to have active voice. Active voice means the subject's doing the action. Subject first, action. The subject's doing the action. So you have Mrs. Fisher, who's doing the action, typed a paper. You wouldn't say the paper was typed by Mrs. Fisher. That's passive. You want who's doing the action. You also need to have verb tense consistency. So all the verbs in a sentence, ed, 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 ing, 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 have, right? Remember that if you have has, had, or will have, that has is present, will have is future, and had is past. So watch carefully for those. Remember parallelism. Parallelism is more than just verb tense consistency. It also means that if you have a prepositional phrase in the first one, you have a prepositional phrase in the second one. So you want to keep it similar, like this. We drove around the neighborhood and parked in the parking lot, right? So we have similar. I like the blue sheer curtains and the steel curtain rods. So if you want it to be consistent. All right, we learned how to put together sentences, and we know that if we have subject, verb, with no punctuation, that's a run-on sentence. The only way to fix it is to put a period between the two, put a semicolon between the two, or to put a comma and a coordinating conjunction, boys, fan, but, or, yet, so, for, and, nor, or combine them with a subordinating conjunction like after, although, unless, until, when, whenever. Any of these words appear, and if it's in the middle of the sentence, it becomes the comma. If it's in the beginning of the sentence, then you put a comma between subject, verb, subject, verb. We also learned that the word because actually is on our list, but has an exception, has two exceptions. One, you put a comma if you can take the because out of the sentence because you don't need to emphasize it. But if you do need to emphasize that because, you don't put a comma. The other time that we put a comma is when it has a negative in the clause before it. And then we put a comma. You put a comma so that the pause is there so that it makes sense. We also learned today that semicolons join two sentences that are closely related. They also are used for two sentences of equal rank. We use semicolons before a conjunction when one of the sentences contains multiple commas in the clause. We use a semicolon to separate clauses if the other clauses contain commas. We learned that we use a semicolon in a complex list that contains its own commas. Remember, these argumentative, narrative, explanatory, essay. We use a semicolon before and after a comma, after an independent marker, and our independent markers were therefore, consequently, however, moreover, for instance, nevertheless, for example, and we put a semicolon before it and a comma after it. And now you are officially done for today. I know it was a short lesson, but you did excellent, and I look forward to teaching you your next lesson. Have a great day.